Welcome to the Squint podcast. Today we were joined by Zaid Dahhaj. He is a circadian biology educator, co-founder of the 2 a.m. podcast, and founder of the Circadian Classroom. We talked all things light and always about getting our light right. So Zaid, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's going to be an awesome conversation here.
Good. I'm so excited. So let's just start at the beginning of the day, because I always talk about getting your light right, and that's this brightness during the day and darkness at night. So can we just start at sunrise? Because everything that I'm reading, all the research is saying how profound the effect of sunrise is on your health, and why AM light is just the starting point for everything. Can you talk about that moment, and maybe even specifically to the women in the audience who may not believe you when we tell them that beta oxidation or fat burning begins at sunrise, and it's so important to have that moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I've looked into that study about beta oxidation in relation to sunrise. I think it can get quite complex, and I don't really understand it fully, to be honest. I still have to go into it. But if we're talking about sunrise as the beginning of, the initiating force for the circadian system, I think it's profound in its effects. You can talk about how sunrise really sets the circadian stage. And so, it allows you to get that cortisol awakening response. This is good cortisol. It's not bad cortisol, as most people typically conflate the two. And that's what starts you up for the day. That's what wakes you up. From that point, you have other aspects of this work in relation to sunrise. You have the fact that red and infrared, which is mostly apparent in that time, is able to regenerate the skin. It's able to set the circadian skin clocks appropriately so that you're prepared for UV light during midday. And it produces filigrin, uricanic acid within the skin, which are moisturizing and protecting skin proteins. And then, from that angle, you can dive deeper into how it starts up all metabolic processes, how it really just activates the circadian system, which then funnels into everything else, because everything is downstream of the circadian foundation. So if you're talking about the first morning light that you get into the eyes and onto the skin, that's what sets the stage for activating the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master circadian clock. And then you have all the peripheral clocks, which are linked to all organs, cells, tissues in the body. So it's incredible when you study it from that perspective, because it is what I call the first domino that sets the stage for everything else.
And so then kind of like walk me through kind of this symphony. So then sunrise is the first domino. It's kind of this 8 to 9, pre-UV time. And then what happens with that UVA light that comes at that kind of 10-degree UVA rise?
Yeah, so that's an important point. It is going to depend on latitude and geography. So I will say it's hard to give a general
Mhm.
recommendation as to how many hours you will have for sunrise, of
Right,
course.
of course.
I would say generally you have, where I am in Southern California, you have about an hour before UVA comes out at the moment. And so UVA rise is particularly important because we're focused on these interesting aspects of the body known as aromatic amino acids. And if you look at them, what they're structurally made of, phenylalanine, tryptophan, histidine, these are all aromatic amino acids. And they're made of these things called benzene rings structurally, which basically absorb UV light, which is why the UVA rise is important. And so when you look into, let's say, phenylalanine, for example, it is the precursor to T3, T4 thyroid hormones. It's the precursor to dopamine, melanin, adrenaline, noradrenaline. So this is a very important cascade of events that you activate through making sure you're outside during UVA rise. And so it will depend on season, like I mentioned. It could be an hour after you wake up. It could be an hour and a half after sunrise. But either way, you want to be outside to get all of the benefits of that. And there's nothing crazy that you have to do. It's just really getting your eyes and skin in the game during that time. And it's fantastic when you also study, let's say, tryptophan, which is the precursor to serotonin, which inevitably becomes melatonin.
Mhm.
And so from that standpoint, you have life's most profound and fundamental hormones and neurotransmitters that are being activated and produced through this UVA rise.
Right. And meanwhile, too, nitric oxide is also being produced at the same time.
Yeah, incredible molecule that I think is responsible for so many things in the body. Most notably, you have the the fact that it's a vasodilator, so it opens up those blood vessels and the arterial walls in general, and it
Mhm.
allows for more blood flow. So if somebody is dealing with, you know, poor blood pressure, anything of that nature related to the cardiovascular system, this is just the top-notch medicine for that.
Right. And that's what Viagra is, right? It's
Yeah,
nitric oxide. I'm just gonna say it.
exactly.
Okay. Uh, eyes and skin in the sun. The eyes, particularly that first sunrise light, and then for once the UV comes, then that's the most important part to actually have your skin in the game, if you will, and have as much skin exposed as possible.
Yeah, I usually say the eyes are going to be the most
Mhm.
important because you're activating this SCN through that. But a lot of people don't think about the skin. The skin is also a light sensing circadian organ. And so we're really just getting both of those out there with as much skin exposed, no sunglasses, no contacts, no prescription lenses, ideally.
Right.
From that point, you should be all set.
And then it's interesting what you said because it was hard for me because as a woman I've been to so many dermatologists and I've been trained, oh, you have to hide from the sun, you better have a large brim hat and sunglasses and the highest sunscreen SPF you can purchase. So it takes a big adjustment for people to kind of regroup and rethink the sun and to see UV as this actually it's a very healing light. It's a necessary light. And in fact, it's a circadian driven light. And we are circadian beings, our hormones, our skin. And so we're kind of taught to keep our skin out of the sun, but it is dependent on this circadian moment.
Yeah, I will say as we move through this conversation, we really do have to couch it in the understanding that there's a difference between reductionism and then holism. So if you look at how centralized dermatologists or centralized medicine at large views UV light and many other aspects of health, it is fundamentally reductive, meaning they only look at one isolated part within the system. They don't look at the overarching broad system, right? And they don't explore the interconnection between various aspects of the system because inevitably every aspect of, let's say, biology interacts with everything else, right? We are directly connected to the environment. The brain is directly communicating with, all other organs and tissues in the body, and so that's an important point that I think is lost upon them, and that's why we view UV light as a necessary wavelength that offers a lot of benefit from the circadian standpoint. And, we acknowledge that it is a relatively powerful wavelength. But when you combine it and when you add it into the the synergistic picture of full spectrum sunlight, the dynamic completely changes, and its relationship to human biology completely changes. So
Mhm.
that's a very important point that people need to understand.
Right. And this is a concept that I try to reinforce, which is the solar callus concept, that it isn't about going out in the sun in the middle of the day and getting as much UV as you can. It's actually building as the sun builds throughout the day, build with the sun and build with the red and infrared and then the UVA and then the UVB. And it's kind of this gradual progression that you have to be a part of and be cognizant of. Um,
Yeah, and by the way, in the same exact way that you view training or cold exposure or heat exposure, like we're talking about stress, hormetic stress, and progressive overload is something that we need to consider. Like you don't just go into the gym and try to squat 200 pounds off the rack when you're a beginner. You
right.
build up to it and you recover and whatnot. You just gradually approach that.
Right. And I've heard you talk, and I think it's so interesting because I always wonder, how did UV get such a bad rap? And it clearly is, profoundly, demonized. But how did we get there? And I had heard you say, and I had read too, that there are studies that when they studied UV, they just studied this wavelength in isolation. And I wrote a blog about, I kind of likened it to Top Gun, and that blue light has to have a wingman. You cannot have blue light alone. If Tom Cruise is in his F-16 or whatever, he's by himself, he's the bad guy. But if he has the other wavelengths of sun, his other wingman, if you will, is that an accurate depiction? And what happened with those studies to make people shy away from UV?
It absolutely is. I think that you have to consider that the sun's light has always been full spectrum. It's always been polychromatic. in nature, I don't think we can find, monochromatic light or isolated blue, especially anywhere. And so that's an important consideration because it tells us that biological systems and human beings, especially as diurnal circadian creatures, were designed to get this full spectrum input in its full scope. And so when we look at let's say centralized research, you quickly begin to realize that it's using all of the studies actually use isolated UV on nocturnal animals, such as mice, which are fundamentally different in skin barrier function, repair cycles, and whatnot to human beings. Or they're either doing that sort of study design on, let's say, cells within a cell culture. So it's fundamentally like just completely different than what human beings are experiencing, right? There's no blood flow, no hormetic response, no melanin. And then they're also doing that research under isolated blue light in artificial settings with a lot of non-native EMF, non-native electromagnetic frequencies around. So I often say that it's really divorced from nature. It doesn't tell us anything about what happens with human beings in relation to sunlight exposure. And further to the point, I think you can extend that or extrapolate that to all skin cancer research from centralized medicine. You can extrapolate that to all photoaging research in centralized medicine. And that's a big problem because it creates false assumptions and it creates this false paradigm that leads us to various things like sunscreen or contact lenses or sunglasses, which I think is iatrogenic in nature. I don't think people are offered informed consent on that end. And it's problematic because iatrogenesis is, like in 2016, I think it was the third leading cause of death in the States. So it is a massive problem that we have to consider. And I think speaking to how we got to this point of UV demonization, we can understand that through the lens of like L'Oreal and Nestle when they uh, decided to step into the industry at large in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They wanted to sell a lot of sunscreens and sun creams and whatnot, and they had to come in and kind of change the narrative in the same way that they've changed the narrative around, let's say, breastfeeding or a lot of these other topics within the health space. And then those kinds of recommendations got into the World Health Organization, and then that led to this. I mean, I would call it a cancerous spread into the population, right? Um, and so that I think is how we got to this point, especially when you study the early 1900s, where you have heliotherapists like Auguste Rollier or Niels Reiberg-Finsen who won the Nobel Prize on this work. So I think it's an extremely fascinating picture once we put that all together.
And we're still taught, reapply after 20 minutes, keep reapplying, keep covering up your solar panel. It's interesting. It's interesting. Heliotherapy, very interesting. I'd love to talk about that a little bit later. But can we just go back to that UVA light? Because I'm tan a lot and I get kind of, people say, why are you so tan? Where did you go? And I said, I actually just laid out in my backyard in the morning. In the morning, they can't believe it. So, can you talk about melanin, when it's made, how it's made, but more importantly, how important melanin is to just the functioning of our bodies and how it informs, all of our senses. We have it in our, in our nose and our ears and our brain. And we actually get a tan from our mitochondria. Could you explain that melanin concept?
Yeah, another incredible concept in relation to circadian biology. I think that, melanin is nature's most incredible and ubiquitous biological polymer in existence. I think that if you look at, let's say, a pink flamingo that has pheomelanin or a black panther that has eumelanin, various different types of fungi that actually thrive using melanin. I mean, you have a specific type of fungus near Chernobyl that actually uses that radiation to grow, which is just mind-boggling to think about. And it points to one of melanin's functions as well. But I think that if you look at it in relation to human biology, like you said, it's found everywhere in the body, which points us in the direction that there's an obvious need for melanin's existence in biological systems, especially human beings. And so if you look through the benefits scientifically, I mean, it's radioprotective, meaning it protects against radiation. So it's nature's original and most effective sunscreen. With eumelanin, responsible for the blacks and browns being 100 or 99.9% effective against UV light. And then pheomelanin's around 30 to 40%. But either way, that rest of the percentage that's left, The body is using that for very important systemic purposes. It's anti-inflammatory, it's an antioxidant, it's been shown to be an antiviral in some cases, um, antimicrobial, antibacterial. I mean, the list goes on, which is incredible when you understand that the dermatologists are telling you it's just a sign of skin damage. That's completely false because that's a reductive approach and understanding of what melanin actually serves as a function in the body.
In fact, melanin actually is a heavy metal chelator, correct?
Exactly. One of its most important functions is that it actually takes on, let's say, aluminum, cadmium, mercury, and it holds on to it essentially, and it slowly or adsorbs it out of the system of the body. So you have absorption, and then you have adsorption. Adsorption is kind of where activated charcoal is similar in that sense, but it is a key detoxifier of these heavy metals.
Which is so interesting because when I, took my heavy metals test and they found the heavy metals, they never talked about the sun. They just poured on a lot of supplements and said, this will fix it. And it did not fix it. And it was only till I changed my light and changed my relationship with the sun that all of a sudden, oh, went away. Somehow my body figured out how to do it.
Yeah. It is a double-edged sword though. So, because melanin can hold on to these heavy metal ions,
Right.
your detox pathways aren't opened up, which by the way, detoxification is controlled by circadian biology, all detox systems in the body. Then you find yourself in a catch-22 because if you're absorbing a lot of heavy metals, let's say you're consuming a lot of shark or you're around a lot of metal work or something like that, and your detox pathways are not as open as they can be, it ends up backfiring on you because you can't expel those heavy metal ions. So people do have to be careful in that sense. But I think if they get enough sun exposure, they build enough melanin, they make sure to have good practices around seafood and whatnot, they should be fine on that end.
Okay. Vitamin D. It seems like that is the wavelength that most people are familiar with, at least. Um, they understand it, they know that it improves their immune system. But can you talk about the process of how you get vitamin D and how we sulfate cholesterol in our skin and what that process is? And then part two would be based on that process, what are your thoughts on actually supplementing with D and how is that different than the D that we make?
Mm. So I'll be honest, like the vitamin D conversion process is very complicated in my mind. I haven't really like gathered it clearly in my mind in how it works. But I will say that it is a complex process and it requires multiple conversions, starting with UVB hitting the skin, sulfating cholesterol, and then eventually going through other pathways, right? We need to understand that that is how the human body it was evolved to require vitamin D. So UVB from the sun, that wavelength range is the only light wavelength range responsible for vitamin D production. You don't produce vitamin D from UVA. You don't get it from other light wavelengths. You need UVB, which means you need to be outside during that time. And then outside of that, if we're looking at obviously the benefits of vitamin D, anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory, just profound in its effects to control the entire system as a whole. And then when we transition to vitamin D exogenously, you have exogenous, meaning supplement form, and then endogenous, meaning the vitamin D your body produces. It doesn't compare, especially when you study the work of Dr. Alexander Wunsch. He breaks down the different transport routes that both go through. And when you study the fact that vitamin D goes through, or vitamin D from the sun goes through the lipoprotein, or sorry, the vitamin D binding protein route, and then you have exogenous, which goes through the lipoprotein route, those are two very different things. And I think this is why we don't see supplemental vitamin D offering as much benefit on the longevity end, especially when it comes to preventing or protecting against chronic diseases. Now, that's not to say exogenous is useless. I think that it might have a use case in some scenarios, but I just think that the human body is incredible in its ability to produce vitamin D3 naturally, which is why I push people towards that instead of using a supplement.
And then another supplement I wanted to talk about, which we produce endogenously, but people crave to take it exogenously, is melatonin gummies or any kind of melatonin at bedtime. And so, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, that story kind of begins at sunrise, right? When we make the cortisol and we put our melatonin to bed and we set our circadian rhythm. And we're learning now that we don't just make melatonin in our pineal gland, but we make it in every mitochondria in our body. 95% of our melatonin comes from there. Yet, at the end of the night, we're not in, we're inside all day, we're in front of screens and we're not making it, so we're taking it. So, what is the actual effect of taking it?
Well, I mean, let's start out with this. I think that we need to understand melatonin is a circadian hormone tied to both the light and dark part of the cycle, right? So you have near infrared light outside makes mitochondrial or subcellular melatonin, and then you have the circulatory form, which comes from the pineal gland, and that needs darkness in order to build up. In terms of the effects from exogenous melatonin or supplemental, I think that from what I've seen, it can potentially cause photoreceptor damage within the eye because melatonin is produced in the eye. And so we get into that idea that if you throw in a reckless input into a system, I mean, this is basic systems thinking, then the system inevitably backfires, creates a backfiring mechanism, and creates second and third order consequences. So there is a direct link between melatonin and eye health. There's some research on mice showing it could potentially damage photoreceptors. Some research in human beings that shows it could definitely make you more sensitive to light because of this feedback loop. And outside of that, I don't, I think it's pretty scarce in terms of the research that is available in terms of negative harm. But I do think we have to follow that kind of cruise philosophy that, we don't really want to take anything that we produce endogenously from outside.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think that's a very important point because people just think that they can solve their issues with a pill, but fundamentally it just doesn't solve anything at the root, which is what we want to get to.
Right. And I think on Squint this week, I'm talking about kind of the chaos of health. And I think women in particular are particularly susceptible to, I don't know if it's our evolutionary beginnings as hunters and gatherers, but we gather everything. We gather every latest craze on health and every diet and every fitness craze. And we're drowning in solutions and it's overwhelming. And and so we want a pill. We want an answer. We want to take care of ourselves and we want to take care of our families. And it can be very, very overwhelming.
It can, and I really empathize with a lot of people on that end because I went through it as well. It's not like, I was born out of the womb just knowing this stuff. And, I've been obsessive about my learning or my education in this realm. And if you want to view it from this standpoint, I mean, look, just viewing sunrise in general will regenerate the melatonin cycle, so long as you have the darkness at night, blocking isolated blue. And the concept that you can just walk out there during sunrise and just look, either peripherally towards the sun or just be outside without any sunglasses with more skin exposed, that's about as close to a magic pill as we can get. So
Mhm.
instead of buying and spending your money on these wasteful pills, you can just go outside and watch sunrise and achieve more of the same benefit.
Right. And this whole return on equity on your health concept, I mean,
It's a
that's
no-brainer.
it's a no-brainer. Best return possible with really the easiest amount of effort.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to go back, just the importance of the eye, and a lot of people are, myopia, macular degeneration. I mean, these issues are increasing exponentially. So I'd like you to talk about that, and then also just can you comment on sunglasses as circadian disruptors? It's something I talk about all the time, and I don't think anybody is understanding what I'm saying. Can you back me up on the sunglasses?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I post this subject on Instagram, it actually gets a lot more traction than the sunscreen and skin cancer debate.
Mm.
It's very interesting to see. We'll start with the sunglasses. I mean, number one, you have to consider that the ocular system is a circadian organ designed to get the full spectrum sunlight into that system, right? Now, I'm not telling people to stare at the sun during midday. That's not what I'm saying. A lot of people conflate that with my message. I'm just telling people to go outside without sunglasses, without prescription lenses, and without contacts when they are safe, and to allow that full spectrum in. Because when you look at the ocular system, you have mitochondria, non-visual photoreceptors, otherwise known as opsins, and then melanin. Those are all light sensing mechanisms that need the full spectrum, uh, for function and for overall health, especially the mitochondria. And then outside of that, you can talk about light sensitivity. A lot of people think that they need sunglasses because they're somehow born with light sensitivity, but it's actually the fact that they're wearing sunglasses chronically that ends up creating a symptom of light sensitivity. And when you study the science of that, because this is something I wrote about recently, melanopsin, the blue light sensor within the eye, it's found in these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that's highly responsible for your ability to create photoadaptation, meaning it really allows your eyes to adapt to various light levels within the environment. And it's intricately tied with dopamine as well in the eye. And so bright light from outside actually stimulates dopamine production, and it also upregulates this melanopsin in the eye. And so they work in tandem, kind of like the best friends or as one team to allow your eyes to adapt to very bright light. Now, the problem is if you're never doing that, of course, you're going to have some sensitivity. There's going to be downstream down regulation of melanopsin. You're not going to be producing as much dopamine in the eye, and then it becomes a vicious cycle.
Mhm.
As if you start implementing the circadian work, it becomes a virtuous cycle. And so that's really the importance of why we don't want to wear sunglasses. And that's not even to mention that sunglasses block the UV light signal into the eye, which then makes melanocyte stimulating hormone, which then makes melanin, which is then protective against any burning. And so it's absolutely incredible when you study the system for what it is.
Right. And it's so interesting to me. And now you know, I'm not a fat shamer, but I am a light shamer. And
Yeah, sure.
I
Sure.
see people, they'll be at the beach and they're sitting there in their sunglasses and they're fried
Mhm.
and they're just so burned. And then they complain about the sunburn. But had they actually not worn those sunglasses, they would have prepared their skin and prepared their body to receive the full spectrum of light.
It goes back to education all the time. This is why I'm not focused on myself as the influencer on social media. I'm
Right.
focused on the work. Like I want to go through
Exactly.
research papers and try to connect the dots.
Exactly. And that's what I say, it's interesting that I'm even on a podcast or social media because I pretty much detest it personally. It's just not for me. But obviously, it's a way to talk about and reflect on some of these issues that I think are really important. But I did, okay, back to sunglasses.
Mhm.
Um, so what I just wanted to summarize what you're saying because I have a lot of women that come up to me and they're wearing sunglasses and they won't take them off because they say, "Oh my gosh, it's so bright. It's worse." And then they refuse to take it off. It's almost very like this visceral reaction, like, "Do not take off my sunglasses." So that's actually a biological reaction they're having. I mean, it's not a fashion issue. That's like their body's feeling that they can't handle the light through their eyes because they haven't developed that capability.
Exactly. And I will say there are a lot of parallels here. So if you talk about tanning, building melanin through sunbathing, if you are somebody who spends most of their time indoors like most people and you have no experience with sunbathing, you will get a severe burn, even with 5 minutes of exposure. I've seen that time and time again.
Right.
And so it's a symptom of your lack of education on this front. Now, in the same way that when you use sunglasses all the time, you never go outside without them, then you will develop serious light sensitivity. And because you're downregulating melanopsin and dopamine in the eye, what ends up happening? You get headaches, you get various other manifestations with eyes or vertigo, because all of the entire system is interconnected. So this is very important to understand. And so when you gradually start to get that AM sunlight, you get used to the brightness, you block isolated blue after sunset, then you start noticing that that light sensitivity goes away completely. I've seen this in redheads. I've seen this in people with blue eyes, blonde hair. I've seen this in people with dark skin across the board. I've worked with people and it works universally because we are a circadian species. So it only makes sense.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about hormones every hormone is circadian. And just from my personal experience, I in my even late 40s, kind of before I should have been menopausal, all of a sudden my hormones were really crashing. And I finally realized when I looked back on my life and how I was getting light, I simply wasn't getting it. I didn't realize it. I was working, I was working for a bank. I was working New York hours in California, so I'd be up at 4:30 and end my day at 3. And in the winter, basically, I was having months at a time with no light. And sure enough, my body went into survival mode and decided, well, we're not going to waste time making hormones. We're going to keep you alive. So can you talk about hormones as, circadian driven, as circadian driven and why that matters both for women and for men?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned earlier, all hormones are circadian in nature. So, this can be proven through a few facts. Number one, every hormone is either diurnal or nocturnal in its pattern. So, in a person who's circadian aligned, for example, cortisol will be highest right before you wake up, and then as the day progresses, it'll dip down, and then it'll be lowest right before you go to sleep. And then melatonin has an inverse relationship with cortisol. So it'll be lowest technically in the morning, although when you throw in subcellular melatonin, that's a different story.
Mhm.
It becomes more complex. And then it'll be highest right before you go to bed. So they're either, diurnal or nocturnal in pattern, depending on what hormone you're talking about. Every hormone has an absorption spectra, meaning it absorbs various wavelengths of light. Especially, it also has a peak absorption, which means that a specific wavelength of light is actually responsible for its function, most notably. And so, if you look across the board at all hormones, UV light typically is the um, the common theme. And it's interesting because it can vary between 280 nanometers, which is, I believe, in the UVA spectrum. I might be wrong on that. I might be mixing it up. Or it can be in the biophoton range. And so that's where we get into the mitochondria and how the mitochondria make their own light. They make light anywhere between 200 nanometers to all the way to like 900 plus nanometers. So it basically encompasses the entire spectrum. And from that perspective, we always go down to mitochondrial function as one of the root causes here. And we need to understand that our lifestyle, especially our light environment, is directly responsible for the quality and the production of our hormones. And so that's especially important for women. I mean, we're talking about massive, skyrocketing rates of infertility. I view female physiology as way more complex than male physiology. And so I really do think they need to be dialed in with the circadian front. I've seen women go from, totally infertile at the time, implementing the circadian work. A year or two later, they're completely fertile and they have a baby. So like this is really powerful stuff. And
Mhm.
I think that the women in this day and age need to take it seriously.
Right. And I would just kind of as a segue to like the other piece of circadian health, which is that darkness at night. I mean, I would have to believe that those women that incorporated, red and infrared and full spectrum sunlight also paid close attention to their light at night. And, it's so important. I think, as the hunter-gatherer theme continues, we hunter and gather at night and we're figuring out our next day. We're coordinating schedules. We're rescheduling meetings. We're doing all these things, and it's really taking a toll on its health. So, I was hoping you could help explain because there's non-native electromagnetic wavelengths, which are the blue light, this blue light that does not occur naturally solo that we're seeing in front of screens. And then there's also non-native electromagnetic fields, the Wi-Fi, the 5G. So let's start just with the blue light and its role in circadian rhythm and what the sources are of blue light, not just our computer screen, but where else are we seeing this? In our indoor lighting, where do we find it?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think this is where we get into the electromagnetic spectrum, which essentially, I mean, we're just talking about light, really. I mean, because visible and the entire full spectrum is part of that, right? So blue in isolation is completely different than blue found in the full spectrum. Again, I mentioned melanopsin, which is the blue light sensor. I think it's responsible for sensing anywhere between 420 to like 490 nanometers, wherever that blue light range
Mhm.
is. And this is the most abundant chromophore in the body. So if you're talking about, by and large, compared to other chromophores, melanopsin is found everywhere. It's found in the skin, the brain, the eyes, organs. And so that's incredible when you consider that we have a light sensing protein all over the body responsible for sensing blue, which is why I think we're actually, from a circadian standpoint, I think we're most sensitive to that blue and we're most attuned to environmental changes in that blue. Now, outside of that, if you're exposing yourself to isolated blue in indoors from artificial sources, you're activating melanopsin, but you're activating it in the sense that you're actually destroying it because you're not giving it the full spectrum input it evolved to receive. And so you're throwing the circadian signal off, which has a cascading effect on every organ, every tissue, every other aspect of the body. You are again actively destroying those opsins, which means that you're creating some serious downstream consequences in terms of circadian signaling, metabolism, all sorts of things. And then I think yeah, in general, you're exposing yourself to a high energy wavelength, which is blue, without the what I call balancing or counterbalancing forces of red and infrared, along with the other wavelengths. And so that has serious consequences for the skin, the brain, the eyes. And that's really why I see isolated blue as a major cause of, let's say, skin cancer or cataracts, macular degeneration, neurodegeneration. And the literature will back this up too. Like you can go on PubMed and find all of these parallels and connections. But
So
when you're
can I ask you, can I just, so it's kind of a dirty trick on us, right? Because we have so many melanopsin receptors, these non-visual photoreceptors that ingest this light that signal to us, signal to our bodies, and they're sensitive to blue light. And I think the reason for that sensitivity to blue light is because it's our timekeeper, right? So we start the day with blue. So we have this timekeeper that is supposed to keep us healthy, but we've created a modern world where we have so much blue, we don't really know what to do with it. And in fact, the blue in modern light is destroying the very non-visual photoreceptors that we need to tell time.
exactly like circadian biology is really just a game of time. And it's a game of how well your body is able to sense and use time, or use light, and then that creates the timing mechanism, right? And so that's like think about. I think I heard one person say that imagine if everyone had broken clocks and they were trying to like get to the train station and get to their meeting on time. Like it would never work. And so I view the entire body in that sense with each organ, uh, protein, enzyme, tissue. It's all synced up very intricately. And so, like I said, the domino, when you push one domino, it has an effect on everything else. And I really do think isolated blue is a huge part of this discussion that not many people in the mainstream health space are considering because they're blaming, um, UV light, or they're blaming skin cancer on UV light from the sun. They're blaming photo aging and wrinkles on the sun. And they're not considering all these other confounding variables that are really important.
Right. And that melanoma conversation, it's so sensitive, right? It's very difficult to even start a conversation and to suggest that someone's melanoma is multifactorial and that it isn't because they got that terrible sunburn when they were 25 years old. It's because they spend most of their current life in front of a screen. They're at a blue lit gym. They're never getting outside and they're on, it's a tough conversation to have. But are you saying that the research is proving this out, that the sun does not, in fact, cause melanoma?
Yeah, well, for melanoma, I completely reject the idea that full spectrum sunlight causes it because there are so many contradictions in the literature. I mean, you have the fact that melanoma patients are large, like universally deficient in vitamin D3 and melatonin.
Right.
So, I mean, the sun is producing these compounds in your body which are fundamentally anti-cancer. And so, what does a chronic vitamin D3 deficiency indicate? The fact that you just don't spend time outside under the sun. You're indoors under fake light, around fake non-native electromagnetic frequencies, which have an impact as well. And then you have the fact that a lot of melanoma cases occur in areas where there's just no sunlight exposure. Uh,
Right. I mean, Bob Marley, he had melanoma in between his toes, and melanoma appears in places that never see the sun.
exactly. And I will inject some more nuance here because I think people don't understand that there are many different forms of skin cancer. There are
Exactly.
also different subtypes of melanoma. But I think it's asinine to say that melanoma is caused by sunlight when there are these subtypes that manifest in areas that just don't get sun. Outside of that, you have the research on like red and infrared being able to stop melanoma proliferation, meaning it stops melanoma spread in its tracks. You have, again, UVA, UVB activating the POMC system, which creates peptide hormones that are anti-inflammatory. I'm sure they're anti-cancer. I wouldn't be surprised to find that. And then, you just study this work at a deep enough level and you realize, like, okay, we have neuropsin all over our body, which is a UVA light sensor. It's just all of these contradictions add up and they make you realize that it just doesn't make sense. There's a lot more to the story.
Right. And then part of the story, and a difficult one, and people, we love our conveniences, we love our technology, and clearly we're using technology now. So what is the 5G and Wi-Fi story? I mean, how does it affect your body at a cellular level?
Well, I will say that I don't think anybody can compare to Jack Kruse in terms of explaining the complexity of it. I think his understanding of biophysics is elite, and I have a few years to get there for sure, maybe even a lifetime, you know?
We all do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will admit, I don't think he even has the full picture. He'll say that, right? I think that non-native EMF is a foreign input to a circadian system, aka our bodies, that evolved to sense natural EMFs. So if you look at mitochondria, you study the literature on that, you'll find that mitochondria are designed or evolved to sense natural EMF like Schumann resonance, geomagnetic fields, various things around that. Outside of that, you have to understand that the entire body is uh, semiconductive in nature. It's piezoelectric, it's flexoelectric, and all of these things are also tied to the magnetic aspects in the electromagnetic aspect of things. And so I think going down to even the cellular level, like the voltage gated calcium channels within cells are, I mean, shown to be electromagnetic in nature without a doubt. Even the inner mitochondrial membrane of the mitochondria, it operates off of electric charge. I mean, this is what Nick Lane has studied as well, and he explained it perfectly. If you look at the membrane of the mitochondria, it produces, I think, around 150 to 200 millivolts of electric energy, right? But when you consider the fact that it is incredibly small in scale, and when you shrink things in nature, the input or the electrical force that it creates is incredibly higher compared to what you would normally imagine. So even though this membrane is like 5 millionths of a millimeter thick, it produces enough electric energy that is equivalent to a bolt of lightning. And so you extend that across the entire body and across the entire electric membrane potential, let's say, and you have a system that is just unfathomably complex in its ability to create energy. And so non-native EMFs definitely have an impact in that sense. It can impact the system at large in very real and fundamental ways. And I think people aren't considering that. Of course, you go into the work of Robert O. Becker. He studied a lot of the stuff in relation to limb regeneration, and he was an active proponent against non-native EMFs, went to have his career destroyed. These are all things we have to consider, and I think that it's really asinine to think that AirPods or the phone or radio frequencies just don't have an effect because they do.
Mhm. And in terms of mitigating those effects, I talk a lot about grounding. Is that something that you would recommend?
Absolutely. The more grounding you can get in a natural environment, the better. There is some controversy in terms of like, is it beneficial to ground next to like, a 5G cell tower or something
Oh,
of that nature?
right.
I would probably avoid that.
Mhm.
But grounding does have a real impact in its ability to just set balance in the system at large because it really allows you to create these free electrons in the body, uptake them from the Earth's surface that is negatively charged, and just reduce chronic inflammation, basically improve hemodynamics, blood function, and blood vessel function and whatnot. But outside of that, I would say just distance is the key. Again, like the inverse square law, there's nothing that beats that because the when you study what the inverse square law is, it just describes that whatever the source of the non-native EMF, let's say, distance is going to have a massive impact because the strength of the signal or frequency drops off exponentially. And so the farther you can get from the source, the better.
So distance is your friend when it comes to everything tech, basically. So your phone, the earpods, anything. The
Yeah. And this is a two-way street, so it works for your benefit as well when it comes to natural EMF. This is why
right.
we connect to the earth. This is why we talk about the importance of biophoton emission. Because think about the light that's produced within and the power of that light. I mean, it's right next to you, right within your body. So it's bidirectional in that sense. And I think this is also why AirPods, for example, are so damaging, or putting the phone up to the head are so damaging, because not only do you have the frequency, but you have the distance. You have barely any distance in relation to your brain and the options and other aspects.
Interesting. Can we talk about biophotons a bit? And this is a little bit more of the advanced version, but I was fascinated just in learning that we actually, I remember looking in a 10th grade biology book and seeing a picture of a butterfly lit up, and then, but just having no impact on me. But then realizing that, we actually emit these biophotons. It's kind of amazing. And then I want to ask you a question because I did a little bit of research and I'm the person that always gets mosquito bites. And I've
Mm.
always wondered, why do I get mosquito bites? Why, 10 people can be sitting there. And there was a long period of my life that I was the one. So are those, my understanding now is that the mosquitoes actually can sense that light and they see that light, which may mean that maybe I'm sicker than the next guy because I'm emitting these low level biophotons. I don't know, just something to think about.
Yeah, it's not something I've looked into. I think I've seen crews talk about it, but to be honest, it kind of makes sense when you think about how bugs are attracted to like, those lights that you put up to try to kill them. I don't know what frequency or what wavelength they're
Right.
using, those lights, but I wouldn't be surprised. That would be incredible if so.
So how does the body biophotons, how does that work?
So, I mean, the let's say the 5-year-old explanation for this is just that when your mitochondria go through normal respiration, oxidative phosphorylation and whatnot, the the byproduct of that is that your mitochondria produce light, again, anywhere from 200 to 900 nanometers, maybe even higher, and then your mitochondria also produce deuterium depleted water as well. And
Mhm.
so these are just the byproducts of these incredible organelles that I believe are fundamentally circadian organelles, light sensing ones. I think the literature will back that up easily. And I think that if you look at biophoton emission and what it's designed to do in the body, I mean, cellular signaling, um, just overall systemic function, it's just so fundamental to the body. And I think that we have a lot more research that needs to be done in terms of understanding the specifics, but we have enough truth and research to show that it's a very real thing.
Mhm.
I mean, scientists even put people in a dark room for 3+ hours to the point where they can only get to see the biophoton emission. Meaning you can't just like put people in a dark room and then automatically see yourself glowing. Like you actively have to put them in a very dark setting to then see this light from within manifest. And at that, you have to have very sensitive and sophisticated instruments to do so. So yeah, that's something I'm actively studying, but it's one of the most incredible subjects in this realm, and it's something that I'm going to actively, go down into as well in the future.
Excellent. So there's basically a light show going on that we can't see, but it is a critical part of our health.
Yeah, and again, I always refer to Cruz because I think he really explains it in the most fascinating ways. He understands biophysics the best, and so uh, I just I acknowledge my limitation. I am a forever student of this game,
As
and
am I.
I hope that comes across. Like I'm not the end all be all of this
Oh,
work.
nor am I. I'm just trying to figure it out. But it is fascinating once you start learning and when you learn from people that are brilliant and actually doing some extensive research and maybe just questioning what we've always known, which is not comfortable, but it's so important if we are going to find out how our bodies work and how we're going to get better. Because, if you look at the data, I mean, you were just talking about eye issues. eye disease is through the roof. But everything's through the roof. And women's issues, I mean, POTS and, ovarian cysts and, menopause. I mean, everyone's struggling and we kind of can't quite figure out what's going on. But we know at a fundamental level that circadian rhythm is the cornerstone. And if we can kind of just get back to this, we might be giving ourselves, a leg up and trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. I have a very enthusiastic perspective on this because I've worked with people one-on-one. I've seen how powerful the body can, you know, regenerate, let's say, or its ability to transform and regenerate is incredible. And I
Mhm.
think through the circadian lens, a lot of the stuff that you think is like super difficult or impossible to achieve, like let's say hyperpigmentation or myopia, you would find a much easier time solving these issues, if not managing them to where they're almost non-existent with the circadian framework. And that's the hope or the enthusiasm that I want to extend to people is that, things like prediabetes or thyroid issues, these are things that can be solved very strongly and very relatively quickly, depending on your circumstance with that lens.
Mhm. It is amazing. And I learned from Dr. Cruz specifically about the sun's action on the thyroid and that it actually, no, I'm not suggesting anyone not take their Synthroid or whatever, but I have talked to women that have shared with me that they actually take less thyroid medication in the summer, that just naturally, as they're kind of getting the right cocktail, getting their thyroid hormone in balance, that they find that during the summer that they need less. And it is interesting when people kind of,
Sorry to interrupt. There was actually, I think, a relatively recent study on red and infrared photobiomodulation showing that exact outcome. That I think they had a specific number of women in the group. They did, one intervention without red light therapy, the other intervention with it, and they found that I think 50% of the participants in the red light therapy group actually got off their thyroid completely, which is shocking to understand
so
because
exciting.
my wife to this day uses Synthroid. Like she's had hypothyroidism for a long time, and we've been actively trying to get this fixed, right? But of course, having a 19-month-old throws a little bit of chaos into the mix. But
Right.
we made substantial progress on that end, so it's definitely possible.
That's really exciting. So I guess the question for us, if Dr. Cruz was here, he would say, Zaid, why are you living in Orange County? Shannon, why do you live in San Diego? I mean, really, why do we? Because I mean, we know the impacts. We know that you can't get well in the same environment you got sick. So I just wanted to point that out because it is kind of interesting that we're all trying to figure this out. But we'll get there. We'll get there.
I will say I do admire his level of expertise and knowledge. But of course, we're all human beings. We're all fallible. I think that there are things that maybe he doesn't have a complete grasp of in the sense that, I live in Orange County. I test my vitamin D. I follow this work to a T and do it very strictly and very well. Like my vitamin D hovers around like 65, 75 milligrams per deciliter. So, I'm not in a low risk category. And I have family here. I enjoy this area. I really love it. And there is a point to where I think worrying about the damaging effects of all this stuff is going to hurt you more than the actual thing. And so I take a very balanced approach in that sense. But, it is real in the sense that if you're living right next to a cell tower, like, you can't really placebo yourself out of that.
Right.
But you have to be very intentional about where you live and what you do. That's the key thing.
Right. And it's interesting what you said about our thoughts because this is kind of a new area that I'm studying and especially in women, it seems that the driving issue of what's preventing their health from being more optimal, totally even aside from circadian rhythm, but it is related, is their nervous system regulation. And they're just so worried about everything. And I keep saying we're in this chaos. We have constant notifications about where our children are located, our ring who's at our door, what are they delivering, where we need to go, how we need to schedule, and we're just so full of these notifications. And yes, there is Wi-Fi and cellular and all those issues, but I think it's just this fundamental dysregulation because evolutionarily, I don't think, we weren't intended to know everything that's going on in the entire world. We weren't intended to have 24/7 news and access to constant stimulation about what's going on. And I think it's really overwhelming. And I think it's really, and I know the same applies for men. This isn't a women's issue, but it's troubling because it's hard for women to even introduce themselves to circadian rhythm because their nervous systems are so dysregulated. And to start anything new, I think you kind of need a little bit more balance. And but even to be open to new ideas, it's challenging. I don't know if you've seen that in your male clients. And what I mean for your male clients, because I do want to do kind of a men's week on Squint. What are you seeing? I mean, what are they coming to you with? What is their biggest issue?
So it ranges. I mean, you have the biohacker types who have no idea what circadian biology is. They see some of my work and they're interested enough to, book a call and then work with me if everything, matches up. But I think it can range from that to men who have thyroid issues, men who are just, overweight, struggle with sleep. And I've worked with people, from everyday 9 to 5 Joes to people who are CEOs who have, little time. So I am very I'm always inspired by how much leverage the circadian framework allows people to have and how adaptable it is as well. I think that there's some common things you really need to have in place, but it is very adaptable. But either way, like I'm very honest in this sense. One of the first clients that I worked with had he previously had thyroid cancer and had his thyroid removed before he even got in touch with me. This was years before he got in touch with me. And I was like, I knew about sunlight. I knew about some circadian stuff, but I wasn't nearly as deep into it. And, even though we put him through this protocol with some of the circadian principles like sunrise and sunbathing, he ended up getting to a point where he was bedridden because of his, removed thyroid. And we got him to a point where he was up and moving. Like he could actively just go about his day without any fatigue, which is huge when you consider the implications of this. And it also reminded me of a tweet that Cruz had a while back where he mentioned that just because you don't have a thyroid doesn't mean that you can't produce thyroid hormone. Like he mentioned that there are extra thyroid cells or something of that nature found throughout the body, which is fascinating when you study T3 and T4 in relation to these cases. But either way, I think that um, I'm very inspired by how much leverage this allows people to have and how it can be applied to so many different things, which is why I've also started to work with women. I feel like women are actually more enthusiastic about the work than men. So I need the men to step up a lot more. But yeah, it's fascinating to see, and I absolutely just love the process. I love seeing people thrive and change their narrative and lifestyle around this stuff.
That's amazing. And just a shout out to the men because I feel like this is one the men that I talk to. How do we convince them to work out outside? And can you just comment on, why you should be moving, number one, and why, and two, why they need to get out of the blue lit gyms?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could explain the scientific aspect of it. I mean, you could talk about how isolated blue can create a hypoxic state in the body, which is not good if you're training and under chronic stress. Um, I just think it's a very intuitive thing for me. Like I don't understand how people, especially men, could not enjoy working outside. Like you get higher testosterone, you become stronger just of the mere nature that you're outside, grounded and under the sunlight. And for me, it's just about being in nature. So I would urge people to, men especially, to just experiment. Like it's not that difficult to do. And I think that if you can get more skin in the game and start to lift weights outside, it's going to connect you to more of a primal aspect of things, right? It's going to, I think, quicken or speed up the results that you get with hypertrophy and training. And there's evidence to show that blue light from the full spectrum reduces body fat as well. All the peptide hormones are anti-inflammatory. They reduce appetite. So you're going to get to your goal faster if you work out outside with skin in the game, as opposed to working out in an isolated blue lit gym that, has 100 people in it at any given time. I just never enjoyed that type of energy and vibe or environment. And so I would highly urge anybody to move outside and start working out outside.
Love it. That's great. Any other thoughts just generally about kind of, I try to focus on day to day kind of simple routines. So starting your day without your phone, getting outside first thing, grounded facing east, no contacts, naked eyes, skin in the game. And then, taking sun breaks during the day to periodically just enjoy this full spectrum sun. And then at night, um, tips for people to get their light right after sundown.
Mm. I think the night portion is probably one of the more misunderstood aspects of it. Because I see people who are trying to implement this work, admirably so, but I don't think they're doing it well enough. When we say that we want darkness at night, we really do mean we want it to be as dark as possible. But that's also why I say we want minimal circadian lighting. So whether it be beeswax candles or an incandescent, maybe even like one of those red spectrum lights. I've transitioned away from those, but those are also good, relatively speaking, compared to isolated blue sources. That's so important. And so after nightfall specifically, you can track it through the My Circadian app and other, resources. But after nightfall, you want the dark lensed orange or red blue blockers strictly on. You want to make it dark as possible. You want to cover your skin with a basic layer of clothing because your skin is a light sensing, melanopsin containing organ. And I think from that point, you should be pretty set. Like you should be able to feel what circulatory pineal melatonin buildup is like. Like you should feel heavy in the eyes. You should feel like you're about to knock out. Like that's how you should feel. And so if you're not, that's an indicator you have some improvement to do on the light environment aspect. But outside of that, I think it's one of the most powerful things you could do. It directly ties into sleep quality. So in bed before 10 p.m., no food after sunset, no liquid after sunset. I'm pretty strict about those things. But either way, there are some ways we can adapt around that. But people should see most of the benefit through that.
That's great. And what's the best way to access your writing and what you're doing?
For me, Substack is awesome. So at ZaidKDahhaj. And then
Okay.
same handles across X, Instagram, and then that's pretty much where I'm at. And then the 2am podcast, which
Mhm.
it seems a bit of a contradictory
I
type.
know the name doesn't work.
But what we're trying to replicate is like the vibe of a 2 a.m. Hangout or conversation with your friends or family at a campfire.
Nice.
Yeah. And
Very
so
nice.
we talk a little bit circadian, a little bit health. We've had Anjan Kata on, who is the
Oh, amazing. Daytime, daylight.
yeah, and so a lot more stuff to come on that end, but it's very exciting and very cool.
Right. I think that, I love how enthusiastic you are because you have to be, and I think, even like, I'm doing this Zoom call, but I have a window open and it's these little things that really add up through your day. And, by the end of the day, and it all adds up and and it's consistency over perfection. Some days you're not going to be perfect and you're going to go to a concert and you might wear your blue blockers, obviously, but you're not going to be perfect every day, but like the body is so forgiving. And if you can just introduce yourself and have this conversation with light and have this conversation with the electrons and the earth and the magnetism that is really drives our body, it's really pretty amazing just to get outside and reconnect and disconnect
Yeah,
with our
absolutely.
tech.
And I will say that the more you practice the circadian lifestyle, the more leverage you have to be able to do some things that are outside it. So, for example, there was a recent study, I think maybe not so recent, but it showed that the more sunlight you get, the less sensitive you are to isolated blue after sunset. And now, while I think that study doesn't explain everything, and I do recommend that people block blue and at night and make it dark, it gives us an idea that the amplitude or the efficiency and the compound interest on circadian rhythm and circadian alignment really holds weight. And so, like, I'm not perfect. I'll go hang out with friends. I won't wear blue light blockers sometimes.
Right.
I'm not that guy who's just like religiously crazy about this work to the point where I'm going to do that.
Right.
I am crazy in the sense that I am obsessed with studying it. And so I want people to understand that there is a kind of a contradictory balance, let's say, that people can strike. But either way, it's I think people can get there.
Well, lucky for us, you are passionate about this and you're doing incredible research and your writing is wonderful. I so appreciate it. It's clear, it's straightforward, and at Squint, we're always just looking for very actionable items to do because not everyone can take the deep dive, but everyone wants to feel well. And I
Mhm.
think there's a way if we just focus on the basics like circadian rhythm that, I think we can move the needle a lot for a lot of people.
Yeah. And there's, it's a never-ending rabbit hole, so I will definitely be writing a lot more articles and creating a lot more stuff for people to enjoy and get actionable tips from.
Great. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.